Hi, welcome to week 10. This week we are skipping ahead to chapter 20 to align with current events. Chapter 20 covers international trade. After a brief review this week in the chapter of international trade, talking about the facts and basics of international trade, the text will use the concepts of the production possibilities model that you learned in chapter 1 to explain why nations trade. Nations specialize in and export those goods and services in the production in which they have a comparative advantage, which means that the domestic opportunity cost of producing a particular good or service is lower in one nation than in another nation. Now, when nations specialize in those products in which they have a comparative advantage, the world can obtain more goods and services from its resources, and each nation enjoys a higher standard of living than it would without trade. The chapter also brings up the question about what determines the equilibrium price and quantities of the imports and exports resulting from trade. The text uses the supply and demand analysis, originally presented in chapter 3, to explain equilibrium in the world market for whatever product it is, right? Now, the equilibrium occurs when one nation's export-supply curve intersects another nation's import-demand curve. Now, people in the U.S. and throughout the world have debated the question of whether free trade production was a better policy for nations, for well over 200 years. Economists have taken part in this debate, and with few exceptions, make a strong case for free trade. Right? They also argue that protectionism, in the form of tariffs, import quotas, other trade barriers, right, prevents or reduces specialization and decreases both the nations and the world's productions and standards of living. Despite these arguments, nations continue to erect trade barriers using an assortment of protection arguments that have possibly questionable validity. The latter sections of the chapter address questions related to how to make trade among nations work better and resolve trade disputes. Multilateral trade agreements have been made among nations, and free trade zones have been established to reduce trade barriers and increase worldwide trade. The WTO, right, is responsible for multilateral trade negotiations among member nations. The European Union, right, is a free trade zone among 28 European nations, and right now the UK, or Britain, decided to leave the European Union, so they're going through negotiations right now about that. The North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, established a free trade zone for the United States, Canada, and Mexico. The U.S. Congress developed policies to assist U.S. workers hurt by the expansion of trade. Now, whether the direction of the trade policy in the United States will be toward freer trade and more protectionism is a question that gets debated as each new trade issues are present in the U.S. public and with each new administration. Right, we are currently seeing these questions play out on the global stage with the U.S., right? Especially with President Trump now, with his recent tariffs and import duties on various goods from washing machines to solar panels and now steel and aluminum. So this week we're going to take a closer look at what's going on in the U.S. news and the U.S. economy and how it's affecting the global economy through discussion articles and through our discussion boards this week.